What's going on, everybody? We have a lot of stuff to get into today, so let's get to it. Bitcoin's been pulling back over the weekend, slightly down today. And the market's looking for two things: clarity on tariffs and clarity on inflation. What's the Fed going to do here? As many of you know, PPI and CPI came out last week, and they both did tick higher. Now the market's unsure of what Powell will do. While we were previously expecting 2 rate cuts, now it's more likely that we may only get 1. And there's basically worries over tariffs, with potentially new reciprocal tariffs on every country taxing US imports. We do have another inflation data point coming. This is going to be next week, and this is PCE. This too has been ticking up. Our December read was 2.6%, November was 2.4%, and it continued down as we go back in the months. This is not what we want to see. We want to see this coming down, not coming up. The Fed wants to be able to lower rates. The Fed can't do this if inflation keeps rising. So this is going to be the next piece of data for inflation that the market will be closely watching. This comes out at the end of the month. We also have something coming up towards the end of the month as well. And this is the Bitcoin Investor Week in New York, as mentioned by Anthony Pompliano. And we have quite the list of speakers. We have Senator Cynthia Lummis, Vivek Ramaswamy, Mike Novogratz, Kathy Wood, and the list goes on. There are going to be some big names, some influential names, and it'll definitely be interesting to watch what goes on here. We also have an interesting tidbit from Google. Google's exploring sign in with Google for Bitcoin wallets. You know, typically when you go to a website, it prompts you to log in. Google can autofill that information. This is basically what it would be planning to do. Google's basically working to make Bitcoin wallets as user-friendly as Web2 apps, with the goal being to make Bitcoin more accessible to mainstream users by basically logging into your Bitcoin wallets with your Google account. And guys, we are already nearly at half of all the states in the US proposing some kind of Bitcoin bill, proposing some kind of Bitcoin strategic reserve. Nearly 24 states are now exploring legislation to establish strategic Bitcoin reserves. And as estimated by Van Eck, they believe the states could collectively acquire around 247,000 Bitcoin, valued at approximately 23.7 billion. This statement was made before we got to 24 states. I think they need to revise this. It is likely more than this at this point. This was mentioned when we were at like 20 states. Now I'll leave this down below for you guys, but it basically goes into all the states, what they are currently doing. It is definitely worth taking a look at. Now looking at Bitcoin, it is just continuing down, facing this descending resistance since basically late January. Bitcoin is now approaching oversold on the 4-hour, the first time it did this since early February, when it did actually bounce from right around 92,000, this support zone. And also, speaking of which, this support zone, ever since November of 2024, we have been mostly maintaining it. There were a few points where we briefly dipped under it, but we didn't get a full candle to close under it. Looking at the daily, you can see that if the market does want to sell it off more, we can definitely sell off a bit more, potentially test this 92,000 area before either getting a bounce or dropping from it. Bitcoin has been under the 50 MA for most of February, and it has been finding it as a resistance as of late, right around $98,000. The 200 MA is still working its way up, heading towards 81,000. I do think at some point in this bull cycle we will test it. We did break under it last cycle. We did test it and break under it, only to break back over it and finish out that last cycle. Whereas in the 2016 halving cycle, once we break the 200 MA, it basically marks game over. We broke it, we tried to reclaim it. Well, we broke it once, we did reclaim it, then we broke it again. It became a resistance, clear resistance there at the 200 MA, and it sold off. Once we start testing the 200 MA or breaking the 200 MA, that's usually when we're towards the end of the cycle. And while we might not test the 200 MA while it's in the low 80s, we might go on a good run. This 200 MA continues climbing as it has throughout this cycle, basically. And then we test it later, potentially when the 200 MA is at 100, 110, who knows? Keep in mind that in the 2016 halving cycle, Bitcoin topped out in 2017 in December. And in the last cycle, Bitcoin topped out around April of 2021 to then barely go higher by the end of 2021, November, December. And in the 2012 cycle, we saw Bitcoin top out in December of 2013. 2025 should be the year that we top out. If we're following past cycles, it'll likely be in the back half of 2025. One thing to consider is we did break all-time high earlier than we ever have in any cycle. Bitcoin has basically this much time until it gets to the end of 2025. I still do believe Bitcoin will reach 150,000 this cycle. I guess this is a good segue into this part that I wanted to go over. JP Morgan recently included Bitcoin in their widely read quarterly guide to ETFs. Banks will be a major catalyst for this space. 2025 is the year Bitcoin enters the mainstream. And they're basically highlighting this boom of digital asset ETFs. The number of digital asset ETFs launched in 2024 was more than 2.5 times the number launched in 2023. Flows into digital asset ETFs were 35 times greater in 2024 than in 2023. Now, if you guys are paying attention to Bitcoin, if you're bullish on Bitcoin, You're very few of retail investors that are. Retail interest has been dropping off a cliff. While BlackRock is loading up, while we're getting news that Goldman Sachs is buying Bitcoin, sovereign wealth funds are buying Bitcoin, companies are putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet for the first time, we have retail asleep at the wheel, or not even in the car in some cases. There are so many reasons to be bullish for Bitcoin. Remember that if we, in the cycle here, if we're already looking at the top, this would be the weakest Bitcoin cycle in history, the earliest Bitcoin cycle in history as well. In a cycle where we have institutional adoption, while in the 2020 cycle we were just talking about the potential for it, we are actually seeing institutional adoption. We're seeing states embracing Bitcoin, considering Bitcoin as a way to hedge against inflation, as a way to bring money into their state. To think that this cycle is going to end here, if Bitcoin cycle somehow does end here, I guess I'd be a buyer in late 2025 rather than starting in 2026. But I do think Bitcoin will top out at 150K this cycle, and these are the opportunities to buy your favorite Bitcoin miners, to buy Bitcoin, to buy MicroStrategy before we end this year strong. But what say you? Are you as bullish as I am? Do you think Bitcoin has topped out? Or do you think it's going to top out later this year? Or do you think it's going to top out in 2026? Bitcoin is literally a part of Wall Street now. Bitcoin ETFs have broke records. Wall Street is definitely closely watching it. Now that Wall Street is starting to grasp Bitcoin and understand Bitcoin, they're becoming increasingly bullish. While retail is fixated on the price not going up, these institutions are buying because they see the bigger picture. But anyways, thanks as always for watching, guys. Do you believe in Bitcoin? Or are you just here to make a couple dollars? Anyways, thanks as always for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.